Welcome, everyone. This is the 6th edition of the ReModelUN podcast, and we're filming this live at the AI for Good Summit, which is also the WSIS plus 20 high-level event here in Geneva, Switzerland in July 2025. We're in a little translation booth looking down at the WSIS main auditorium, and I am here, François Grey, University of Geneva, with my good colleague Tina Ambos, who's in the same faculty, the School of Economics and Management of our university. Also here with Sharada Mohanty. Mohanty is working for AICrowd. He's the CEO and founder of that company. We're here with the youth perspective on AI as well as the corporate one. We're here to talk with you, Tina, about how to remodel the UN. And you are one person who's given a lot of thought to this. So you are teaching a lot about the sort of management of these international organizations. You're interviewing them, you're writing reports about innovation in International Geneva and in the international sector. You've created associations that promote innovation in International Geneva. You're leading an effort with a collaboration called Giga. You're coming to us directly from an event at Giga this morning, which is part of the AI for Good Summit. Tell us a bit about Giga and the event you were just at.
Well, thank you, François. Thank you for having me for the podcast. That's amazing. Yes, I'm just coming from Campus Biotech, where the Giga Connectivity Forum, as part of the AI for Good Summit, takes place. Giga is a fascinating initiative. It's a startup coming out of two UN organizations led by ITU and UNICEF. And it is quite amazing as an organization because it truly is very innovative and it really runs like a startup, which is very different than the big bureaucracies we're used to. And Giga's mission is to connect every school to the internet by 2030, which is a daunting mission. And we at the university have the pleasure and really honor of collaborating with them to help support them on different pillars on the research side, so that we're really creating evidence in terms of what school connectivity does and how we can take decisions based on the data that shows the case for connectivity, which of course is the basis for AI use. And this is the topic of today. But we're also working very much with Giga to involve them into our coursework, into teaching. We just had a keynote speaker from our master's course opening at the Giga Connectivity Forum, reporting how connectivity has changed his life and his education journey and the work he's done in his studies on the project. And the third pillar is, of course, outreach and connecting. And this is what is so important also about the forum and about the summit here, that we have this diversity of actors here. We have innovators, we have tech people, we have representatives from governments, we have the international organizations, of course, and also the general public, which I believe is very important for that whole endeavor we are embarking on.
Absolutely. And of course, we have youth well represented. And the Youth Day of WSIS happened in the Giga Connectivity Center just 2 days ago. We were there, and it was fantastic to see all the enthusiasm about how to rethink the Model UN concept and how access to internet would play a role in not only in connecting schools, but in connecting young people who can make a difference through Model UN itself. So Tina, what you're saying about Giga is fascinating. Can you give us some numbers for exactly how many young people are still unconnected to internet?
It's quite a dramatic one. Out of the 2.6 billion across the globe, people who are unconnected, more than 500 million are students who actually don't have access to connectivity. Having said that, they already connected 8 million schools, so that's amazing. But we're still working very hard towards an ambitious target in the next couple of years.
Big numbers to think about. Great. At this point in the podcast, we're going to deep dive on a few topics that you've worked on and where we'd like to define some problems that young people could really get their teeth into, whether it's through a Model United Nations or some kind of hands-on learning or experiential workshop or summer school. So let's get on with the challenges that you see on the horizon. The first of which really connects with the work you've been doing for many years now on innovation in International Geneva and bringing this forward into time in International Geneva of huge crisis. People are being fired left, right, and center from the international organizations. NGOs are shutting down overnight. In this mood of dramatic change, what do you think innovation means for this international sector and where can it help?
Yeah, these are really tough times as the international development sector is defunded across the globe. I think Geneva is facing a particularly harsh challenge because this has ripple effects on all our infrastructure and our economy, also in the private sector. So the challenge is always in a time of crisis. The two things that are being cut first is learning and innovation. And if you think a little bit forward, these are the two things that really could move organizations through a crisis. So it's a little paradoxical that those are the ones that are defunded most, but this is the reality. So how can we actually keep innovation in international organizations, and how can we make them fit for the future? I think these are the two questions that I've been dealing with in my research for quite a while, if already before the crisis we are seeing today. I think two important avenues. The one is really changing the way how we work, right? This is going right into the ReModelUN thought. How can we make organizations more efficient and use AI, for example, as new tools, but also how can we make them more creative, more forward-looking, more innovative? And I think AI also plays a very big role there. The second element to that is how can technology and AI really transform innovations as such, right? When we're talking about innovation these days for international organizations, it's not only about the products and the services that we can, for example, provide to lift people out of poverty, to provide education, to map disaster areas, something like that. But it's also about how decisions are being made in organizations and how we can actually make sure that there's some, bottom-up creativity that is so important for innovation. How can we make sure this is being embraced in organizations? And so this transformative role is the second one, which I believe is really important. And in Geneva, we are lucky to be at the operational center of innovation at UN organizations. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of best practices. And now is the time to elevate them, to harness them more, and to take them as an example to reinvent the future.
Fantastic. And I know that you, Mohanty, have been in a lot of conversations with UN organizations and NGOs. And from your perspective in trying to bring innovation through a corporate structure like AICrowd into these organizations, do you see the challenges getting worse in this time of crisis, or do you see opportunities as well?
I do see opportunities as well, because culturally people are a lot more willing to listen to something that is very different. Because my personal issue at trying to figure out these interfaces with the UN organizations, international bodies, was if I have a large team of people who are highly technical, they operate in a completely different culture. And here we have a large group of people who are working on high impact problems that's touching the lives of billions of people, and they work in a completely different culture. How do I get both the teams to even talk to each other, forget about collaborating? And in these times, people are a lot more willing to listen to something that is very different, and also a lot more willing to come find that middle ground that can create that interface that I believe will create exponential progress over time.
In terms of some of the work you've done, there is this that you wrote on embracing the new frontier, as you called it, artificial intelligence initiatives in international organizations. Now, I know that in this area, even though that's a very recent publication, it's already getting a little bit old. So give us your thoughts on what you see from that report as the obvious areas where AI can make a difference, and maybe what's even shifted in the last few months for you since you published it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think really we're early days where we really thought, where is AI in the UN and how could that fit and how potentially could we adopt it? And while the data is already old now, I think the predictions we actually drew from this report are very much true, and it very much resonates with what you said, Mohanty, because it really is these professional silos that we have between administrators, bureaucrats, but also like innovators who are working with a very human-centered way. They often have problem to connecting to tech people, right? And this acceptance of technology, I agree with what you say, there's more urgency, more awareness to this there at the moment. But I think there's also a heightened risk awareness in terms of, will AI take on our jobs? Will it take my data? Will I still be the person that, I am? And of course, in the UN system, there are lots of jobs that, may get automated very soon, like translation. We're working a lot with translators and UN Secretariat, because obviously translation is a big role. And there's lots of discussions about how we can use AI, how we use it to validate, what is the interaction between the humans humans and technology. And we're having all these tough discussions where we have this interface of technology and of humans. So can you share your experiences from your work with us?
Yeah, so that's also a very cultural difference on how we approach, because again, given the scale and magnitude of the problems many of these international organizations work with, by nature, a lot of the decisions are based on intuition and also, of course, some research and whatnot. But from our point of view, when I'm looking at it from a technical, completely engineering point of view, you always try to avoid making any decisions with intuition. You always try to come up with some kind of a small experimental framework which will give you some numbers. Then the decision is made based on those numbers, right? So when we talk about different kind of interventions for that might enable some innovations, or we're trying out different kinds of innovations across different projects or different organizations, the first question I will have 10 different ideas. How would I know which of these innovations actually worked and which did not work? And then I would want to create an iteration cycle where I would assume the first few things I will try are not going to work, but I want to iterate through them really fast so that I will converge to a point that works, right? So the question you brought about translators and interpreters, right? So in that case, my ideal way of approaching it would be, okay, let's go ahead and see about whatever metric we care about. Okay, what is the quality of translations and interpretations? And we measure how many mistakes they make in comparison to humans, how much time do they save for the interpreters, and how can the same cognitive power of these trained interpreters be used to scale up the impact. For example, now not every large-scale event or small-scale event can afford to have a small team of interpreters which are doing real-time interpretation and whatnot. Then we basically go ahead and say, okay, now our ambition is, can we cover with the same group of interpreters 10 times or 100 times the number of events or discussions, but across all of these, the initial experimental framework which just makes that decision process easier needs to exist. And right now, my experience has been trying to approach it that way has not always worked out.
Yeah. If I may react to this, I think what is really important is this idea of iteration, right? So this is not only something that comes from technology, that's also something that we've learned in agile management, for example. This is something that I've also worked with the UN to experiment, like many years ago already, how agility can be more implemented in the UN, right? And now we have the technological base to do that. The challenge also comes from another side, which is, of course, all the AI training data basically comes from, to a large degree, from English language, to a large degree from Western thought concepts. And of course, we speak translation, some of the languages, they're not as common, they might not have as good as training data as the English-speaking models have. But also we see this not only in translation, but also when we're trying to solve local problems, because many of the grand challenge problems, whether it's climate change, poverty, education, they're highly localized and locally embedded problems. And I hear a lot from people in the UN working in the field, but also from NGOs who work on the ground, that the results they get from AI is not as good as the results we may get from AI in Geneva and Switzerland when we're trying to approach a local problem here, because there is a bias, obviously, in the data. So this is also something, I think, another silo, another divide that's not only the one between tech people and non-tech people, but between people in headquarters and people in the fields, potentially.
And here I would actually also add my perspective. Even if I'm at the interface, there, for example, if we take the exact idea of bias in the training data on which we are training these large language models, the way we crudely measure it from a technology point of view is just by looking at the distribution of the data. Then we say, okay, this model is not expected to work as great in Odia, let's say, or as it would in English or Spanish or French, so on and so forth. And then the crude metric captures just the rough first order bias that we have in the data set, but it does not manage to capture all the second, third order cascading effects of that. For example, now if I deploy a small agent whose job is to go and order something critical online, and this would be a series of one agent which will do a whole lot of tasks on the localized web that this agent sees, now the performance will be crazily different. And once we are able to really put those numbers there, then the argument around this bias will be slightly different. We won't be saying that there is a huge bias against Odia or any other language by these LLMs. We will say, okay, first, let's look at the first order the bias that we have in the data sets. It's this distribution, there is this distributional shift in here. But over time, when we look at the cascading effects of the performance of these agents, right, now we see a significant degradation, but that also adds in that sense of urgency with which we will have to act. And both the decision makers or anyone who cares about what is the impact of those agents, they should be the one, from my point of view, who would be really putting the foot down and saying this needs to be addressed with this much of a sense of urgency. Then only we can actually really convince the broader technical community to take it as seriously.
Yeah, I mean, we're already deep in AI, but you actually asked me what our report said. And one is obviously the silos, but the other one is also this kind of the risks and the ethical guardrails that organizations have. And that is really speaks really against the urgency, because we build organizations to also have legitimacy to actually take careful decisions to account for all the risks that we're having. So we're also operating in space where we need to be really careful, because our decisions will have a huge impact and there will be vulnerable populations. And so I think we have to, in organizations, balance this speedy, urgent implementation and this kind of trial and error kind of mindset against one that, has ethical safeguards, that is well thought through, that has all the accountability and the legitimacy that our system actually was built for. And I think there's a little bit of paradox that we're also seeing in the report, which asks, how can we implement it? And I think that would be the really tricky question: how can we really implement AI initiatives in those types of organizations?
I think this is a great segue to a third challenge that I think comes really from what you're saying about the risks of making decisions based on AI without really having tested it. So how can we test it? Well, we can simulate different scenarios and see what different responses that AI suggests produce, at least in a simulated model. One of those simulations is the Model United Nations itself. We can get young people to run simulations of specific negotiations and then see how much they diverge depending on how the arguments go. But I'm wondering more widely in International Geneva, since you've done so much for the movement in International Geneva with the NGOs, do you see opportunities and maybe already actors moving in with solutions at the sort of NGO level to simulate or use AI in ways that will allow diplomats to do things that they haven't been able to do?
Well, I think there's a billion of initiatives. So I'm not exaggerating. I think there's really many initiatives that have a lot of potential, where I think the really critical points, and this is again where ReModelUN is a great initiative, is how we can really the top-down and bottom-up alignment, because obviously I want to make sure there's an innovation mindset. I want to make sure that tech solutions are evidence-based, but also they are implemented fast. But then I want to democratize information and decision-making rights in organizations, because these big bureaucracy and the slow type of decision-making processes that we have are holding us back. So I think this is where the top meets the bottom. This is a really critical element where we are not only speaking about using AI tools as tools for getting better predictions, getting better data inputs, getting better oversight, but also to really transform the way we can make decisions, right? The one that you mentioned before, iteration, I think is one of the most powerful ones. That iteration is another word for experimentation in a way in an organization, right? So there's experimental mindsets that also demands us to allow failures, which we are usually not allowed to let in our organizations. And the universities are very similar to this, right? There is not a lot of room for failures. You get it right or you drop it. And this transformative element, I think this is what I'm really seeing. To really answer your question, I think a model organization like Giga, for example, I think is an excellent one, because it really captured its startup mindset. It uses AI to map the schools around the world and to get better evidence in order to make decisions which schools to connect first and fastest. Also, its way of working, while embedded in the UN structure, it really acts like a startup, and it's much faster, much more agile. And I think these are the types of models also where we bring different sectors and the different mindsets together that are fit for the future.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. And you're right, Giga, which brings together two UN agencies which often work in their little silos to solve a common problem. This is the way forward in a time of reduced means. We are going to have to see more of this cross-sectorial collaboration. It's just necessary with limited resources. And hopefully it will do what the SDGs were supposed to do, is really get people to work across problem domains. Great. I think this is a good time to talk about the next big changes in AI in these institutions. And one of them will be the role of agents, AI agents. People throw that word around, but we're not always quite sure what people are talking about, or they're talking about different things. We recently interviewed two of the leaders in the youth community of the MyMoon platform about possibly integrating agents into MyMoon negotiations and seeing what essentially an agent would do negotiating with or against other youngsters. Quite a lot of hesitation about this. Is this the right time? What will youngsters think if they're beaten by AI agents in a negotiation? But at the same time, a deep fascination, because I think the younger generation gets it. It's the future, whether you like it or not. How do you see agents and where do you see them making a difference in the, let's say, real UN?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. I think this is really a topic that everybody's trying to solve, that not only the UN, but also all types of private sector organizations. How can we better use agents to augment our activities rather than to replace us? What I've seen in international organizations is also this idea of using it necessarily as a competition, but really kind of working together, collaborating, whether you call this assembling or augmenting. There are all these different jargon words out there in the AI human interaction debate. But how can we really complement our skills and abilities as humans? So we can use agents as sparring partners. For example, we've run a scientific experiment with UN leaders on letting them model their own personalized AI agent versus giving them an AI agent that we modeled for them. And we're looking actually at, how was that better received? How was the technology adoption better in those models than in others, which was quite fascinating. But I think where the future is and what is even more mind-boggling is if we're thinking about an organization of agents, right? So if we have a committee of agents that will take decisions that can just open a bigger opportunity horizon, right? So we may have committees, may have team members, maybe have shadow organizations. And I think, again, in the ReModelUN exercise, I think it's an amazing opportunity to think about these new models because they're also breaking down the bureaucratic silos. But also in real world, they are actually enabling us to model very flat, non-hierarchical structures into bureaucracy, right? Because these agents, obviously we can make them responsible and we can think about, what they should be accountable for. But obviously they will have very different rights for the time being than normal employees and staff members. So I think this is a really interesting question from an organizational design perspective, how you can integrate agents into a specifically bureaucratic organization.
Amazing. These are a lot of avenues for development, and I think this A/B testing in real-world scenarios is going to produce some fascinating results. How do you see this agent business? Because you're also developing some of these solutions.
Apart from developing, I was a fairly early adopter of agents way before they are as good as they are right now. But then along the way, I personally basically kind of figured out some places where they were really working back then. Now they're just amazing. But then I was also measuring what is my productivity. And funnily, this has also been pretty well studied just in context of code because the problem specifications are really well defined. You can actually measure them at scale across thousands of developers. So agents at this point of time are studied most closely in context of code, but my hypothesis is that everything we learn from that experience of how adoption of agents in coding has happened will happen across multiple other organizational avenues, and we will probably have to invent new ways of kind of measuring their impact. So one interesting thing about agents is when I'm using an agent to delegate a coding task, the more complex the task is, the higher the chances for the agent to fail. And the other thing is, even if it's a moderately sized task or smallish task, the number of interactions the agent has to make, the chances that it will fail and break down exponentially increases. So now with these two takeaways in mind, and we assume this translates directly to other organizational tasks that you have, right? When we're thinking about organizational design, then you think that anyone in your small organization is now given a small team. They can be humans or agents. It just so happens that they have these properties. They can fail, but they can confidently fail. Sometimes they just ensure your mind is completely blown. And now your job is to organize them in such a way that you kind of get more value than you are investing in terms of energy. So a lot of your role ends up becoming supervisory because the agents are still not accountable, as you said, and that's a major drawback. So the buck stops at you, so you are accountable for it. How do you organize them? And across different tasks, we will have to design, experiment, iterate in safe ways on what works, but we also need to be prepared a little bit ahead in the sense that when I started using coding agents, no one expected they would work, right? Only a small people of real believers, like there's no way this won't work, right? Because you're seeing a few other graphs which are just exponentially increasing. Sooner or later, this has to work. And the moment a few of these graphs just cross these thresholds, it just unlocks an explosive amount of value. The same thing is not being done across different tasks. The tasks in an organizational context where it unlocks that value is not even well defined. And a great example for that is what OpenAI pulled off with deep research, for example, right? At the end of it, deep research is actually an agent which goes and looks up a whole lot of websites, gathers everything that is needed, asks clarifying questions, harnesses it in a report, right? And they did it in a very specialized, productive way. that enables them to sell it as a standardized product to everyone. But a lot of people that I know, like with different experiences in tech, they had a clear, well-defined value that they got out of these deep research agents that OpenAI released. Now the question is, can organizations start thinking about already building their own personalized agents and figuring out how they can, with evidence, know this is the point that we can confidently set it out. And that has to happen well before the agents can work. So that has to happen when the agents are premature, but you already are setting up the infrastructure.
You're pointing to the role of management, of leadership here. And I think from a management perspective, there are three elements that how you can control in general in an organization. You can control inputs, right? So what is the purpose of using these agents? For example, in the UN, we have the representation of member states, for example. You have diversity in teams. So if I don't have the diversity that I need in my team, I can actually model them, right? I can model diverse agents to inform my decision making. That's one. And here I'm really controlling with inputs. The second one is output control, right? So I can actually then validate the decisions. I can tell, are they performing? Are they not performing? So what are my KPIs? What are my safeguards there? And the third one is the process control, which prescribes how is my interactions with these agents? Is my interaction with the agents actually modeled? So is this a sequential process where part of it is done by the agents and part is done by me and this iterates? Or is it like a parallel process where we both come to an outcome and then compare? And I think a lot of thinking at the moment, and again, an excellent puzzle for the students, has to go into at the input, at the output, and at the process level. How do we structure our interactions with those agents and what are they good for and what is the value add? And at the moment with all this AI hype, sometimes we're really forgetting what's the value add of this, right? You pointed a lot to performance, you pointed to cost savings, but often the value add of AI really is also creativity, is opening up a bigger space for solutions and opportunities, because we as human beings, also an excellent team of people, we are really bounded by our experience and by our ways of communicating with each other. And this is something where I think AI opens opportunities, but also we have to be very intentional about what we're trying to achieve by that.
Absolutely. And I think this is a great level at which to wrap up the conversation. It reminds me of the documentary AlphaGo about how DeepMind beat the world champion of Go. And this moment in the documentary where it becomes clear that the human champion is going to lose. And all the human fans are suddenly realizing this is the end of an era of human domination. There's a sort of sense of sadness. But at the same time, one of the other world champions says, maybe at last we're going to understand what the game of Go is really about. And I think what you're pointing to is a world in where at last we're going to understand what management is about. And thanks to your research and to projects on AICrowd and many other platforms, I think we're step by step getting there. So Tina, thank you very much for your time, and we wish you a great conference at AI for Good and WSIS.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It was great to speak to you. Thank you.